Hello and welcome to another Tuesday night Pell session. Tonight I'm going to be talking about practicing fighting from your knees against a Pell. Quite often people are surprised by how hard it is to fight from their knees. However, if you think about it, there's very good reason for this. When we normally fight standing up, we use large rotation of the upper body and the pushing off of the legs to project the force forward. While we're down on our knees, we lose a lot of the ability to actually project that force forward and do large hip motions. This, coupled with the fact that our opponent is usually above us, means that the sword needs to be brought forward to give ourselves some head protection and dropped near the back to give ourselves wrap protection, means your hand is in a very different spot to how you would normally form up and practice against the Pell. For this reason, you really do need to actually do the fighter practice and the power generation practice against the Pell. Now, as I was saying, when you are facing against an opponent who may be standing, you are focusing roughly at their head. This means everything is to some degree pointed upwards. Blows are going to be coming from that range, which means when you have your shield, you need to bring it in front of you. You need your sword in front of you. This means that shots, if you don't practice them correctly, are just going to be pushes of the arm, like so. And this has no power at all behind it, and your opponent can easily block it by just taking up the center line there. Instead, what we want to practice doing is getting that sword and actually dropping it slightly behind the back of our head and throwing it forward to get deeper shots around the side, clearing this center line. You can still throw through the center line if you want. It just needs to be so that you choose to go down that center line rather than defaulting to it and just pushing forwards. This small drop behind the head can be used to generate a fair bit of power without moving the shoulders and the hips to a large extent. How this works is you start a small shimmy, a small hip rotation as the sword is going back to power it forwards. It is, interestingly enough, one of the situations where you do start your first shot by taking the sword backwards, which gives you a bit of space. One of the other things it does, by dropping that sword backwards, it clears this center line here. If your opponent, if you think about this Pell right now as my opponent trying to block that center line, if I'm up forwards here, I have almost no throwing space to go forwards. So by dropping that sword back behind my head, it frees up my sword from any kind of blocking line, stealing of the space to allow me to throw forwards. So what I'm trying to do with these motions is to get sideways, to get around, and to get deep on the Pell, even though the Pell is really close in front of me. Another thing to play with while fighting against the Pell is to practice slightly different kneeling positions. The previous spot that I was in was fairly square against the Pell. That has some advantages in that it allows me to go quite wide. However, what it does do is keep that center line, and that if my opponent pushes forward onto my sword, it's quite hard to clear that sword. However, if you bring your shoulder back and just kneel on a bit more of an angle against the Pell, this allows you to clear that arm right back and hence get it out of any kind of bind that your opponent may want to try and press upon you. However, it again does mean that your shot range and angle is now a lot more down the sword side of the Pell, and it is a little bit harder. It's not impossible to get to the offside, but it is something that you have to figure out and work more on. Those positioning of the knees do come in greatly with the different ways to generate power. And so therefore you should practice shifting slightly around to different knee angles to figure out what works with you for you, generating power against the Pell, and also looking at what gets stuck out there. For example, with my sword shoulder right back, my shield is projected further forward, which could give me a further out block, but means that my back, right back over here, is a little bit more exposed as well to any kind of sky wrap shots that my opponent chooses to throw or wraps around the back. The other thing to practice when you're fighting against a Pell is to change the distance you are on your knees. Everybody likes to have a nice bit of space when they're fighting their opponent. So for example, here, you can move, you can feel fine, you can feel safe, you've got space to maneuver. However, some opponents will actually come in and stand right on top of you, which means you're much more likely to be fighting from this range. So again, change your range, change your angle, change your positioning to get the practice of trying to throw shots into something so close. Because again, a sword in front pushing from that range is really not going to do a lot. There are a couple of tricks you can do to catch your opponent off guard, and you should practice them obviously. One such trick is just running your sword up one side of the Pell, flipping it over to hit the other side. This allows you to get a nice long throw distance, generate power through that entire arc, and then flip it over to hit the other side. In an actual fight, this has the advantage of your opponent thinking a sword shot is coming in on this side of them, flipping it over, hopefully catching them behind the shield and getting yourself a body shot. Another good shot to play with is to practice throwing high and then dropping the hand to a first percussion point into the leg. So basically what we're doing here is we're practicing throwing as if we're going to go for the head, throwing up and then just dropping it straight down into the leg. This is another good one. Try and get that shield to lift and to open up your opponent. Lastly, a trick that I do like to throw a lot when I'm actually fighting a walking opponent is to catch them off guard by raising and lowering my own body position. If they want to actually come in right on top of me, I will tend to lean back a bit to clear space so I can throw. And then as they step forwards, I will come up to take that space away from them and thereby stop them being able to dominate me too much, and instead I get to play the range game. One last thing that I should point out: when on your knees, it is very important that you don't display your ankles out sideways. So having your ankles so that you're sitting on your own toes, on the tips of your toes, or having your feet lying flat in a straight line as if you're kneeling for a Japanese tea ceremony or something, all very good. However, if you turn your ankles and put your feet out sideways, that puts a twisting strain on your knees and actually causes a lot of damage to your knees, so do be careful about that. It is also true that it's, for a lot of the Western fighters, it's not a particularly comfortable place to be at, but it is something that the more you practice being down on your knees, flexibility, straightening it up and so forth, the better you'll get at it and the less pain you'll actually get from being down there. All right. So next time we'll talk a bit more about fighting from the knees and using that shield positioning. But for now, let's just practice throwing shots when you've got not a lot of space in front of you and you can't do large pushing body motions to generate the power. I will see you next week, so have a good one until then. Bye.